At our 40th anniversary dinner with our family, my wife stood up and said, "I want to be honest. I never loved you. I endured 40 years only for your money and the kids. I'm done." I raised my glass and left silently. The next morning, the bank told her all her cards had been canceled. Before we continue, subscribe to the channel and tell us in the comments what city you're watching us from. My name's Aurelio Medina Fuentes. I'm 63 years old. I'm a property appraiser, retired for 2 years after more than 3 decades evaluating properties, contracts, documents, and the real value of things. My whole professional life consisted of looking at what others didn't want to be seen and saying exactly what it was worth. I faced what happened with that same precision. But to understand how I got to that night, you have to know the beginning of it all. I arrived in Madrid in 1979 at 19 years old, with a brown leather suitcase that had been my father's and a folder with photocopies of my high school diplomas. I came from Guadalajara, from a neighborhood where the streets weren't fully paved and where the word future sounded like something that happened to other people. My father worked at a printing press. My mother sewed other people's clothes at home. There was no money for whims or for doubts. What there was work and the certainty that if you didn't build your own path, nobody would do it for you. During my first 3 years in Madrid, I slept in a boarding house on Calle Embajadores that I shared with 4 other men. I'd get up at 6 in the morning, study at the public library until it closed, and in the afternoons, I worked as a clerk in a haberdashery in the Lavapiés neighborhood, whose owners paid me in cash and without a contract. I never complained. It was what it was, and I worked with that. In 1983, I finished my appraisal degree and began my first collaborations with a small real estate agency in downtown Madrid. The salary was low, the work was plentiful, and the city was in the midst of a full transformation. The real estate boom of the 80s came like a tide that lifted everything that was floating, and I had learned to float before the tide came in. That same year, I met Consuelo. It was at a party in a coworker's apartment on a Saturday in October with a light rain and the smell of fried food. Consuelo was 20 years old, with dark hair tied back in a long braid and a way of looking at things that seemed serious, adult, different from the empty conversations that took place at those gatherings. I asked her what she did. She told me she was studying to be a teacher. I asked her if she liked it. She replied that what she liked was having an answer for everything. It seemed brilliant to me at the time. It seemed exactly what I wanted by my side. 3 months later, we started dating. 8 months later, she asked me to make it official. It wasn't a romantic request or one full of emotion. It was direct, almost administrative. "Aurelio, either this has a future or we end it here." I was 23 years old and had just gotten my first stable contract. I said yes. We got married in April 1983 in a small ceremony at the civil registry in Guadalajara. There was no honeymoon, no big celebration. There was a lunch with our families, a bottle of cava my father had been saving for years for an important occasion. And on Sunday afternoon, we were back in Madrid on the 6 o'clock train. Consuelo looked out the window for almost the entire journey. I interpreted that silence as tiredness from the day. It never occurred to me that it could be anything else. What there was from the first day was work, a lot of work. During the first 10 years of our marriage, I built the foundation for everything that came later. Every signed contract, every delivered appraisal, every retained client was another brick in something I imagined as solid. In 1989, we bought our first apartment in Carabanchel, small, with a window that looked out onto an inner courtyard and a dampness in the walls that took me 2 years to get under control. Consuelo decorated it with what we had. She didn't complain about the size. She didn't complain about the dampness. At the time I interpreted it as maturity, now I see it differently. Gonzalo was born in 1986. It was a quick birth, earlier than expected, and I arrived at the hospital with my shoes wet because I had run from a technical inspection in Alcorcon in the rain. I held him in my arms in that small room that smelled of disinfectant and paper and felt something I couldn't name then, but which I now identify without difficulty. The greatest responsibility I had ever had in my life up to that moment. Consuelo looked at me from the bed with a tired expression. She didn't say anything. Neither did I. There was something in that silence I should have paid attention to and that I let pass. Nuria arrived 4 years later. In 1990, the birth was longer. I waited in the hallway for almost 5 hours with a cold coffee in my hand that I never finished. When they let me in, Consuelo had the baby in her arms and said, without looking at me, her gaze fixed on Nuria's face, "This we did right." It was the only time in 40 years I heard anything like that from her. I didn't forget it. Over the years, the company grew. In the mid-90s, I opened my own appraisal office in the Arganzuela neighborhood. 3 employees at first, then 5, then 8. The work consumed everything, mornings, afternoons, several weekends a month. Consuelo took care of the children with an efficiency I never questioned. She managed the household accounts with precision, organized school schedules, and showed up at parent-teacher meetings when I couldn't. It worked everything it worked. And I, who spent my life evaluating the real value of things, never stopped to evaluate what was happening inside my own home. Conversations between Consuelo and me existed. Of course, we talked about the children, about money, about pending repairs in the apartments, about who would call the plumber, but talking about what each of us felt about whether we were okay or if we were barely getting by. That stopped happening at some point in the 90s without either of us pointing it out. I assumed it was the normality of a long marriage. Consuelo never corrected me. Now I understand why. In 2015, I retired. The company was left in the hands of a trusted partner, and I dedicated myself to managing our own assets. 2 apartments in Madrid, the country house in Guadalajara, which had belonged to my parents and which I renovated with my own hands over many weekends, and the 30% of the company shares that I transferred to Gonzalo that same year as a gift for his 30th anniversary. It was a gesture of paternal pride, not calculation. I wanted my eldest son to have something concrete, something built, something he could call his own. What I never imagined was the way he was going to use that gift. They're the notarized power of attorney that I signed in 2020. Consuelo presented it to me one Tuesday afternoon with no apparent urgency, telling me that the manager recommended having it in order now that I was retired, that would facilitate the administration of the properties without me having to travel to sign every minor procedure. It seemed reasonable to me. I signed. At that moment, it was just one paper among many. Later you'll understand exactly what was done with it. The eve of the anniversary, Friday night, Consuelo asked me if I had confirmed the restaurant reservation. I told her yes, that everything was ready for 9 on Saturday. She nodded, went to the bedroom, and closed the door. I stayed in the living room with the television on without seeing anything. 40 years together, 40 years of mornings, dozens of hospitals, of moves, of small arguments, and long silences. And at that moment, sitting on that sofa we'd had for over a decade, what I felt wasn't nostalgia. It was a kind of strange, dense calm, the calm of someone who has already finished preparing everything that needed to be prepared. On Saturday night, we arrived at the restaurant at 9:05. The table was reserved for 12 people. Gonzalo with his wife and their 2 children, Nuria with her partner, and 4 close friends that Consuelo had insisted on inviting. I greeted each one, sat in my place, ordered a red wine that I'd always liked, and listened to the conversations move around me. Consuelo was at the other end of the table. She looked at me once when we arrived, just once. In that look, there was something that at another time I would have interpreted as discomfort. But that night, with everything I already knew, I recognized it as something else. It was the look of someone who has made a decision and is counting the minutes to execute it. The appetizers arrived, the wine arrived, the laughter of the grandchildren running around the table arrived. Everything had the appearance of a normal night. Then Consuelo stood up, tapped her glass with a small spoon, and asked for silence. The table gradually quieted down until the only sound left was the murmur of the restaurant and the pounding I felt in my temples. And then she said it, "I want to be honest with all of you because you've been witnesses to this marriage for years, and I think you deserve to know. I never loved Aurelio. I put up with 40 years for the money and for the children. I'm done." 8 pairs of eyes turned towards me at the same time. I saw Nuria's face fall apart. I saw Gonzalo lower his gaze to his plate. That detail, that gesture of my son looking away instead of looking at me, confirmed in a second what I had known for months. I stood up slowly, took my glass, made a toast alone in silence, looking straight ahead, not focusing on any face. I took the exact amount of money for the wine out of my pocket and left it on the tablecloth and walked out. I didn't run, I didn't raise my voice, I didn't look back. That night, I slept at home in my bed with the window ajar and the sound of the street rising from below. I didn't feel what Consuelo expected me to feel. I felt something more like the stillness of someone who has nothing left to decide. The next morning, at 9:04, the bank sent a notification to Consuelo. Her cards had been canceled and her access to the joint account blocked. She called my phone 3 times. I didn't answer any of them. On Monday morning, I found a photograph in the desk drawer that I wasn't looking for. It was small, one of those developed at kiosks in the 80s with the white borders slightly yellowed by time. In it, we both appeared in front of the Carabanchel apartment when we had just gotten the keys. I was wearing a brown corduroy jacket that I don't remember ever throwing away, Consuelo with her hair down, and a serious expression that at the time I interpreted as concentration, and that now, looking at it from a distance of 40 years, I recognize as something different. She wasn't smiling, she wasn't looking at me. She was looking at the building's door like someone evaluating a purchase, not like someone starting a life. I put it back in the drawer and went and made myself a coffee. To understand how I got to that photograph, to that apartment, and to that woman, we have to go back to the beginning. Not the beginning of the marriage, but the beginning of it all. Because what I built didn't start the day I got married. It started much earlier in a city that was completely strange to me and with empty hands. When I arrived in Madrid in 1979, the entire country was in a kind of slow, confusing awakening. The dictatorship had ended 3 years earlier. There was a mix of newfound freedom and old fear in the air that people carried with them without quite knowing how to shake it off. I didn't understand anything about politics. I understood work and not having. That was motivation enough. The boarding house on Calle Embajadores cost 4,000 pesetas a month. There were 4 beds in a room with a window that opened onto a light well, from which the smell of other people's stews rose every afternoon. My roommates were a construction worker from Extremadura, a veterinary student from Salamanca, and an older man who never said where he came from, and who every morning read the newspaper from cover to cover before going out to do something that none of us ever found out with certainty. We weren't friends, we were 4 people sharing a roof without getting in each other's way too much, which was the only thing we needed from each other. I studied at the appraisal school for 3 years. Classes were in the mornings. In the afternoons, I worked in a haberdashery in Lavapiés, organizing rolls of fabric and serving ladies who knew exactly what they wanted and wouldn't tolerate having their time wasted. I learned to listen. I learned that people reveal much more than they think when they talk about what they consider theirs. The first computer I saw in a professional office was in 1984 at the real estate agency where I started collaborating after finishing my degree. It was a large, noisy machine with a green screen, which took up half a desk and was only operated by the boss with an almost religious reverence. The rest of us continued working with paper files and pocket calculators. The world was changing, but it was doing so slowly, like everything that changes for real. I met Consuelo in October 1982 at a co-worker's party. I already mentioned it, but what I didn't say is what happened in the weeks following that first encounter. I called her twice before she answered. When she did answer, she didn't apologize for the delay or explain it. She simply said she had time on Thursday. I went on that Thursday and the next and the next. Consuelo was orderly, direct, and not very given to displays of affection. At the time, that seemed to me a sign of character. She came from a family in the Vallecas neighborhood, father a postal worker, mother a housewife, 2 older sisters already married. She was the youngest, the one who had studied to be a teacher, the one who was going to be a teacher. She had a confidence in her gestures that I, newly arrived from the province and still learning to navigate the city, found magnetic. What I failed to read, then, was the difference between confidence and distance. We got married in April 1983. The ceremony was at the civil registry in Guadalajara because my parents couldn't afford the trip to Madrid and I didn't want them to be left out of anything. Consuelo didn't protest. She organized the details of the lunch with an efficiency that left my mother with nothing to manage, which my mother appreciated and I admired at the time. The kava that my father had saved for years for some occasion tasted of fruit and relief. We made a toast. We left. On the train back, Consuelo slept leaning against the window for almost the entire journey. I read the Sunday newspaper that someone had forgotten on the seat in front. Neither of us spoke much. I called it the tranquility of the day. I didn't ask myself if it was something else. The first years of marriage passed under the sign of work. Mostly mine, the long afternoons on construction sites, the technical visits that extended longer than planned, the reports I finished sitting at the kitchen table after dinner, while Consuelo read or watched television in the living room. She didn't complain. She managed the household with the same precision with which she organized everything else. When Gonzalo was born in 1986, she adapted without much fuss. When Nura arrived in 1990, the same. Everything worked, but there's a difference between what works and what lives. And for many years, I didn't stop to distinguish between the two. That's a mistake I accept without excuses. The prolonged absences, the weekends absorbed by work, the conversations that always remained practical and never reached anything else. I was responsible for all of that. I don't say this to justify what Consuelo did later. I say it because it's true and because lying to myself now at this stage would be the only thing I really can't afford. I remember a Sunday in 1992 when Gonzalo was 6 years old and Nura was barely 2. The four of us had gone to eat at my parents' house in Guadalajara. On the way back in the car, the children were sleeping in the back seat, and the radio was playing a song I no longer remember. Consuelo was looking out the window. I drove for almost an hour without either of us saying a word. At that moment, I called it the peace of the road. Now I know it was something else. The silence between two people who love each other sounds different from the silence between two people who simply coexist. The problem is that when you've spent enough time in the second, you no longer remember what the first one sounded like. In 1995, I opened my own office in the Arguenzuela neighborhood. It was the year I worked the most hours in my entire life, including the times at the boarding house. Consuelo never protested about the absences, never complained about a lost weekend or a canceled dinner. What I then interpreted as understanding, over the years I began to see differently. It wasn't that she was okay with me not being there. It was that my presence or my absence was equally indifferent to her. That distinction is subtle, but it's not minor. What there always was order. Consuelo kept the household accounts with an accuracy I never questioned because I had no reason to. Every expense noted, every bill in its place, every paper where it should be. She had a blue shoebox from a now-defunct boot brand where she filed documents that I never reviewed. One afternoon, I saw her placing it in the hallway closet and asked her what she kept in there. "They're old receipts. Don't bother," she replied without taking her eyes off what she was doing. I believed her. There was no visible reason not to. And there's a kind of trust that isn't a virtue, but a habit. And for a long time, I confused the two. Gonzalo grew up to be the kind of son that makes a father proud without the father having to try to find it. Diligent, punctual, orderly in his way of thinking. He studied business administration in Madrid, finished without any setbacks. And when it was time to look for a job, he knocked on my door before any other. He joined the company learning from the bottom up, from the most basic technical visits. From the smallest reports, he learned quickly and asked few unnecessary questions. I saw in him something I recognized without difficulty, the determination of someone who knows that things don't just happen on their own. In 2015, when he turned 30, I transferred 30% of the company's shares to him. It was done before a notary, with all the paperwork in order, without any conditions attached. Oscar Navarro, who had been my lawyer for over 2 decades, asked me before I signed if I was completely sure. I told him yes, that I wanted Gonzalo to have something concrete, something I had built with my own hands, and that he could continue. Oscar wrote everything down without adding anything else. What Gonzalo did say, that afternoon, while we were having dinner to celebrate, was something that at the time didn't carry the weight it should have. "You were always too generous, Dad." It didn't sound like a compliment. It sounded like an evaluation, like someone calculating out loud what they're receiving and mentally noting the figure before changing the subject. I let it go because it was my son's birthday, and because I had uncorked a wine that had cost me more than usual, and because at that moment life seemed exactly what I had worked for decades for it to be. Now I know that in that sentence there was a key and that someone had already decided which door to open with it. Nura was always different from her brother, more open, less calculated in her reactions, harder to read in a good way, and easier to love in daily life. She studied education, worked at a public school in the south of Madrid, and when her partner got a transfer to Zaragoza, she followed him without much hesitation. She came to Madrid less frequently than Gonzalo, but when she did, she filled the house with something I couldn't describe with precision. Consuelo was always more distant with her than with her brother. She had been since Nura was little. I never knew exactly why, and I never asked her. There are questions you decide not to ask, and there are questions you simply don't ask because you're too busy looking the other way. Mine were almost always of the second type. That doesn't absolve me, but it's the truth. In 2019, we celebrated 36 years of marriage. We didn't celebrate it anywhere special. Dinner at home, the children with their partners, the grandchildren running down the hallway. Consuelo made rice pudding for dessert, which she had always been good at. I opened a bottle of cava. Noah made a formal toast. She cleared the plates when we finished with the same efficiency as always. Before I fell asleep that night, I thought that 40 years weren't so far away and that we should think of something to celebrate properly. I didn't imagine then what kind of celebration it would be. What I also didn't know yet in 2019, what I wouldn't discover until a year later, was that at some point that same year, Consuelo had taken a concrete step, something related to that blue shoebox I never opened, with a lawyer whose name I didn't know at all, and with a plan that had been in the making for longer than I could have imagined. But that story begins in 2020 on a Tuesday afternoon when I came home earlier than expected and found the tablet on in the living room with a conversation open on the screen that wasn't addressed to me and whose words stayed in my chest for days before I fully understood what they meant. "Aurelio, have you moved my things from the living room?" Consuelo's voice came from the kitchen when I had already been standing for several minutes in front of the living room table with a lit tablet in my hands. It was a Tuesday in March 2020, just after 5 in the afternoon. I had returned earlier than usual because the meeting with the property manager of the Retiro apartment building had been canceled at the last minute, and I came home without announcing myself, as I always did, because in 40 years of marriage, I had never felt I needed to announce my arrival. The tablet was on the living room table, leaning against the fruit bowl with the screen on and unlocked. I saw it as soon as I walked in. It wasn't strange for it to be there. Consuelo often used it to watch series in the afternoons and check her email. What was strange was what appeared on the screen. It was a messaging app we shared on the tablet, though I almost never used it from that device. The contact was saved only with the initial M, no last name, no profile picture, no other identifier. The last message sent by Consuelo, completely visible on the screen, said, "When the papers are ready, I'll be able to be free." There was no visible reply from the other side. I read the sentence twice, then a third time more slowly, with the same method I used when reviewing a contract, looking for the clause that didn't fit with the others. "Aurelio, I'm here," I replied. "I haven't touched anything." Consuelo appeared from the kitchen doorway. She looked at me for a moment. Then she looked at the table where the tablet was. Her expression didn't visibly change, but there was a moment, barely a second, when I saw something settle in her eyes, a kind of relief that had no reason to exist if the conversation on that screen was irrelevant. She went back to the kitchen without saying anything else. I sat on the far armchair and stared at the window. The sound of traffic rose from the street with its usual regularity. I didn't feel an immediate alarm. I felt something harder to define. The impression that the ground under my feet was still the same as always in appearance, and yet something in its composition had changed in a way I couldn't yet measure. Papers free. 2 words that separately could mean anything. A work matter, a bureaucratic procedure, a conversation between acquaintances about some personal issue with no relation to me. I didn't want to rush to a conclusion that could be completely wrong. That night, I had dinner without mentioning anything. Consuelo served lentils with chorizo and an orange for dessert. We talked about the guest bathroom faucet that had been dripping for weeks without either of us getting around to calling the plumber. She said she would sort it out the next day. I nodded. The conversation lasted as long as the lentils. Then we each went about our business, as had always been the case in that house. What changed from that afternoon on wasn't my outward behavior. It was the direction of my attention. Not suddenly or obviously, but in the quiet way that the gaze of someone who for decades learned to see what others prefer not to be seen is oriented. The real state of a facade, the crack that the owner has repainted 3 times but that is still active in the structure, the inflated price because the seller knows the buyer has no technical tools to argue it. That way of looking isn't turned on or off, it's just directed towards a different objective. I began to observe Consuelo with that same gaze. It didn't take me long to notice small details that at another time would have gone completely unnoticed. The phone that she used to leave charging in the kitchen at night, she now took to the bedroom without me asking. She would place it face down on the nightstand when we were together in the living room, something she never used to do. Some calls, not many, but not few either, she would answer by closing the bedroom door. When she came out, she had that particular expression of someone who has just confirmed something and is processing it internally without letting anything filter out. I also noticed that Consuelo had started spending more time in the study at certain times in the afternoon. It wasn't something I could point to as definitively strange. She had always had her own business, and I had never asked her about the details of what she did when she was alone. But there was something in the way she closed the study door, softly and without noise, that was different from how she closed it when she simply wanted silence to read. All of that wasn't enough to reach any firm conclusion, but it was enough not to look away. In November of that year, Gonzalo called to confirm Christmas Eve dinner at home, as usual. He with his wife Elena and their 2 children, Nura, arriving from Zaragoza with Marcos on the 23rd. We agreed that dinner would be on the 24th at 9. The night of the 24th passed without any apparent incidents. The grandchildren ran down the hallway, as they did every year. The sea bream turned out well. Nura brought nougat from Zaragoza and a bottle of Somontano wine that was better than expected. Consuelo managed the kitchen with her usual efficiency, without any visible nervousness, talking with Elena about the children's school activities with the naturalness of someone who has nothing on their mind. I set the table, served the drinks, asked Marcos about his job transfer. Everything functioned with the superficial normality of a family night that has nothing to hide. It was on the morning of the 25th when something happened that I couldn't get out of my head. After breakfast, when the children were still in the bedroom with their gifts and Elena and Nura were on the terrace having their first coffee of the day, Gonzalo and I were left alone in the living room. It was a December morning with that white, sharp light that Madrid has in winter. It illuminates everything with too much clarity, without warming anything at all. I asked him about the company, how the last quarter had gone, if they had had any difficulties with the most recent contracts that I remembered were pending before I retired. Gonzalo took a second before answering. It wasn't a long silence. It was barely perceptible, the kind you don't notice if you're not looking for it. Fine, he said. Everything's under control. And the contract with the developer in Alcala. In October, you mentioned it was still open. It's closed now. Don't worry about it, Dad. It's all in hand. And before I could add anything, Gonzalo started talking about his older son, that he wanted to sign up for swimming, that their apartment in Vallecas was getting small with the 2 children growing up, that they had been looking at options in the south of the city. A fluid conversation, without pauses, perfectly constructed to fill the space where an uncomfortable question could have fit. Gonzalo was not a man given to unnecessary fillers. He was direct, of few words, when the words didn't add anything, one of those who listen more than they talk. That change of register, that sudden eloquence right after a question about the business, was something I mentally noted without showing any reaction. What almost went wrong happened that same afternoon, around 5. I had gotten up to get my mobile phone charger, which I had left on the desk in the study. As I passed through the hallway, I saw that the master bedroom door was ajar. I heard voices inside, Consuelo's and Gonzalo's, speaking in that low, restrained tone that people use when they don't want to be heard but haven't completely closed the door. I stopped in the hallway. A second, too. I heard Consuelo say, clearly, not yet. There's still time. Gonzalo replied with something I couldn't quite decipher. 3 seconds in that hallway would have been too many. I understood it instantly. If either of them looked towards the door, if the floor creaked under my feet at that moment, if there was any sign that I was standing there listening, everything I built later in silence would have collapsed before it had a form. I continued walking towards the study at a normal pace. I picked up the charger, went back to the living room, and sat next to Elena, asking her about her shifts at the hospital where she worked as a supervisor. Neither Consuelo nor Gonzalo left the bedroom for the next 10 minutes. When they appeared, they both had the same expression of ordinary calm, as always. Consuelo went straight to the kitchen. Gonzalo settled into the armchair opposite me and resumed the conversation about the new apartment as if there had been no interruption in the afternoon. I served more wine. I asked about the swimming. I smiled at the right moment. Control isn't just about knowing when to advance. It's also about knowing when to retreat without anyone noticing. Gonzalo and his family left on the 27th. The farewell hug was the same as always, brief, firm, with 2 pats on the back, which were no different from any other year. I closed the landing door and stood for a moment in the hall with my hand still on the knob. The first days of January 2021 I spent with a calmness that surprised me a little, not because the anxiety had disappeared, but because I had made a decision that settled naturally. I wasn't going to make a move based on suspicions. I was going to wait until I had something concrete in my hands before acting in any direction. It was exactly what I had done for 30 years of work. Before signing an appraisal report, you gather all the available documentation, cross-reference the data, verify that the sources are solid, and only then do you write a definitive figure, never before having what's necessary on the table, never based on what you think might be. I didn't have what was necessary yet. I had a sentence on a screen, a conversation cut short in a hallway, and the behavior of a son who changed the subject too easily when the business was mentioned. It wasn't enough. Patience isn't inactivity. It's an instrument with its own edge. And I knew how to use it better than anything else I had at my disposal. What I didn't know yet was that Consuelo had taken concrete steps long before that message on the tablet. Steps with dates, with names, with the signature of a lawyer whose existence I was completely unaware of. And that the answer to everything was stored in a place in this house where I had passed by hundreds of times over the years without it ever occurring to me to look. February 2022. It was 3:15 in the afternoon. Consuelo had left mid-morning saying she had a dentist appointment and that she would then stop by her sister's house, that she wouldn't be back until 6. I was looking for the car insurance certificate because the ITV inspection was scheduled for the following Thursday, and I wanted to have it ready. I opened the drawer, moved a couple of folders aside, looking for the document, and the envelope was revealed at a different angle than usual. Something about that angle, the way it had been turned when I moved the folders, made it visible in a different way from all the previous times. I took it out, not immediately. First, I held it in my hand for a few seconds, looking at it. The weight was that of several sheets of paper, not much more. Consuelo's handwriting on the front was the same as always, small and neat, the same I had seen for 40 years on shopping lists, in diary notes, and on birthday cards. I heard the sound of the television from the apartment above, filtered through the ceiling, with that characteristic muffling of old Madrid buildings. I felt the cold of the paper between my fingers, that dry cold of office material that hasn't been exposed to anything in particular. I opened the envelope. Inside were 4 sheets of paper folded in 3. I unfolded them on the desk carefully, without rushing, with the same method one uses to spread out a technical drawing you don't want to damage. It was a draft of a property division, a real draft with a law firm's letterhead, with clause numbering, with columns of assets separated by categories. The name of the firm was Sanchez Vega Asociados, with an address on Calle Serrano. The date on the letterhead was September 2021. On the first page were the 2 Madrid apartments, the Guadalajara house, and the funds in the joint savings account. In the left column, the name of Consuelo Ramos as the beneficiary of the properties. In the right column, a calculated financial compensation for me that represented approximately 40% of the real market value of the properties, according to the appraisal they themselves had commissioned. An appraisal that wasn't mine, an appraisal commissioned from another company with figures that I immediately recognized as deliberately conservative. I kept reading. At the bottom of the second page were two handwritten lines written in a different handwriting from Consuelo's, tighter and more vertical. They said, "Confirm use of power of attorney before registration. Gonzalo, give the okay." Gonzalo. I reread those two lines 3 times. Not 4 or 5. 3, because by the third time, there was no alternative reading possible. Below those lines, in the bottom margin of the page, there was a signature. A signature I knew perfectly well. I had seen it for years on company contracts, in formal communications, on the notarial document the day I gave him the company's shares. It was my son's signature. I didn't say anything out loud. I didn't hit the desk or throw anything. I just sat in the desk chair looking at that signature for a time I couldn't exactly measure. It could have been 30 seconds, or it could have been 2 minutes. The sound of the television from the apartment above continued with the same regularity. The street traffic was still the same. Nothing in the outside world registered anything. What happened was something internal and without noise, like when a structure has been moving imperceptibly for a long time, and at a certain moment the displacement exceeds the threshold, and everything that was resting on it falls into its new position. Without drama, with the specific gravity of what weighs what it weighs and cannot weigh less. I found the power of attorney on the third page. It was a copy of the one I had signed in 2020 with the annotations I had referred to before. In the left margin, handwritten with the same blue pen as Consuelo's, was a series of technical instructions on how to invoke the instrument to make changes of ownership without the need for a new signature from the principal. The annotations used correct, notarial terminology. It was not an improvisation. Someone with real legal knowledge had dictated those instructions or had written them directly. It wasn't Consuelo. Consuelo was efficient administratively, but not legally. Those notes came from the Sanchez Vega firm, or from someone who worked with them. I folded the 4 sheets exactly as I had found them. I put them in the envelope. I placed the envelope in the drawer at the same angle and position as I had found it, with the same folders in front. I took the car insurance certificate that was at the bottom of everything and closed the drawer. I went to the bedroom. I looked in the closet for a warm jacket I hadn't worn since the previous winter. In the inside pocket, where I kept things I didn't want anyone to see, I put the phone and used it to photograph the outside of the envelope, the 4 sheets one by one, and the handwritten annotations in detail before putting everything back. Then I placed the phone in the inside pocket of the jacket I was wearing, not the one in the closet, and went down to the car. I drove for 40 minutes with no fixed destination, on the A5 toward the southwest, then back on the M40, then along the Paseo de la Castellana to the north, until the traffic got dense enough in front of me to force me to slow down. I didn't think about Consuelo. I didn't think about Gonzalo. I thought about the signature at the bottom of that second page and what it meant from a technical point of view, that my son was not a passive witness to what was happening. He had given the okay. That was the exact expression. He hadn't been dragged into anything. He had evaluated the situation and had decided to participate. The envelope stayed in the car's glove compartment. Consuelo arrived at 6:10. She brought a shopping bag with 2 yogurts and a box of cookies, which was usual when she came from her sister's house. She took off her coat, hung in the hall, went to the kitchen, everything exactly the same as any other afternoon. I was in the living room with a newspaper. I looked up when she came in. "How is your sister?" "Fine. Her knee is still bothering her, but she's fine." "And the dentist?" "A cleaning, nothing new." She nodded towards the kitchen and disappeared. 5 minutes later, she came out with a cup of chamomile tea and sat in her usual armchair. She opened a magazine. The afternoon continued just like all other afternoons. The moment I was about to make the one mistake that could have cost me everything came a week later. I had been keeping the photos of the envelope in a code-protected folder on my phone, but I hadn't yet moved them to a more secure location. Gonzalo came by that afternoon without warning, which wasn't completely unusual, but not frequent either. He said he was in the area and wanted to have a coffee. Consuelo wasn't home. I made the coffee. We sat in the kitchen. Gonzalo asked about my plans for the spring, if I was thinking of opening the house in Guadalajara before the summer, as we usually did. I told him probably yes, that the boiler needed to be checked before the season. We talked about that for a while. Then, Gonzalo pointed to my phone, which was face up on the kitchen table. Dad, that model is a few years old now. Haven't you thought about changing it? At the company, we've managed a hardware update, and I have a pretty good one left over. I could bring it to you. It was a perfectly reasonable offer. It was the kind of thing a son does for a father. And if it had happened at any other time in the last 40 years, I would have accepted it without a second thought. But at that moment, with the photos of those documents saved on that phone, with the folder protected by code that Gonzalo didn't know, but which I couldn't guarantee couldn't be recovered in some way if the device ended up in his hands, the offer took on a completely different dimension. I'll think about it, I said. I still get good performance out of this one. Gonzalo smiled. As you wish, no rush. He didn't insist. He finished his coffee, talked a little more about the children, got up, and left 20 minutes later with the same calm tone as always. I walked him to the landing door and closed it when I heard the elevator go down. That same night, before falling asleep, I transferred all the photographs to a password-protected cloud storage account that no member of my family knew about. Then I deleted the folder from the phone and emptied the device's trash. What I still didn't have was the piece that connected the name of the Sanchez Vega firm with the money movements that would have had to occur to finance that whole process without my noticing, because someone had paid for those hours of legal advice, and that payment had come from somewhere. The answer was in a place that wasn't the envelope in the drawer or the handwritten notes. It was in the blue shoebox that had been in the hallway closet for years. The same one that Consuelo told me, without taking her eyes off what she was doing, contained nothing more than old receipts. I hadn't opened it yet, but that was about to change. The box was exactly where it had always been. Second shelf of the hallway closet on the right, behind a set of spare sheets that Consuelo folded with a precision that would have shamed any hotel establishment. It was a dark blue cardboard box from a boot brand that no longer existed, with the corners slightly crushed by the weight of what was on top of it. I had seen it for years without really seeing it, which is something completely different. I waited for a morning when Consuelo went out to do the weekly shopping. It was a Thursday in March 2022, 3 weeks after I'd found the envelope in the desk drawer. I had waited that long on purpose, not out of indecision, but because opening that box on the same day I'd found the envelope would have been a mistake in timing. If Consuelo noticed anything out of place, any sign that the order of the closet had been altered, the entire chain would break. 3 weeks of flawless behavior. That was the necessary margin for any possible alert that might have been generated to be completely dissolved. I took the box off the shelf, placed it on the living room table carefully, as you place something that might contain fragile material. The lid fit with a slight resistance of the kind that cardboard produces when it has been closed for a long time in a poorly ventilated environment. I lifted it. Inside there was no disorder. There was order, which was much more revealing. Consuelo didn't keep junk in that box. She kept documents organized by date, separated with small folded strips of cardboard that she herself had cut and labeled with the same blue pen, as always. The label said 2019, 2020, 2021, 2022. 4 years of payments, 4 years of parallel management to everything I knew about our life together. I started with the oldest year and worked my way forward. The 2019 documents were the scarcest 2 fee receipts from the Sanchez Vega y Asociados law firm, both in the second half of the year, each for €500 paid by bank transfer from an account I didn't recognize. It wasn't our joint account. It was an account in the name of Consuelo Ramos Medina at a different bank than the one we usually used, opened, according to the letterhead of one of the receipts, in June 2019. June 2019, for months before our 36th anniversary. The same year we had had dinner at home with the children, and I had uncorked the cava thinking about the upcoming 40. The 2020 documents included 4 more receipts from the same firm. One of them dated October of that year, which was the same month I had signed the notarized power of attorney. The accumulated amount that year was €2,300. There was also a copy of a printed email without the body content visible because it had been deliberately cut, but with the header intact. The header included an email address I didn't know. Cramos963 at a free email server. Consuelo Ramos, born in 1963. An email account I was completely unaware of. The year 2021 was the densest. 6 fee receipts, the last of them dated November. The total accumulated that year exceeded 6,000 euros, and among the receipts, there was something else. A bill from a notary, not the same one I usually use for my professional business, for advisory services on notarized powers of attorney. The date was August 2021, 1 month before the draft of the property division was drawn up. I photographed every document. Then I returned the box to the shelf in the same position, behind the same folded sheets with the same precision. It took me 15 minutes to make sure the closet was left exactly as it was before I opened it. That afternoon, while Consuelo was preparing dinner, I was sitting at the study desk with a paper notebook and a pen. I didn't use the computer because the study computer was shared, and I didn't know if Consuelo had a way of seeing which files had been opened and when. In the notebook, with the small, tight handwriting I used when taking technical notes at work, I began to build a map. On one side of the map, the marriage assets with their real market values, which I knew exactly because I had spent 30 years appraising properties in Madrid and Guadalajara and knew what every square meter of what we owned was worth. The Carabanchel apartment, renovated and with the mortgage paid off since 2007, was worth between 280,000 euros and 300,000 euros at that time. The one in Retiro, in a more in-demand area, was no less than 420,000 euros. The house in Guadalajara, with the plot and accumulated renovations, between 110,000 euros and 120,000 euros. On the other side of the map, the valuation that the Sanchez Vega firm had used in the draft of the property division. Their figures were 35% below mine. In all cases, it wasn't a calculation error, it was a deliberately depressed appraisal, so that the financial compensation assigned to me would seem reasonable, when in reality, it was less than half of what I was entitled to. There was another variable I recorded in the notebook, the power of attorney. Technically, the instrument I had signed in 2020 granted Consuelo the ability to manage administrative procedures related to the properties. What the handwritten notes on the copy from the envelope intended was to extend that scope to the modification of registered ownership. But that extension was not automatic or legal. For an ordinary power of attorney to be used to transfer ownership of real estate, it needed a specific notarial wording that expressly enabled it for that purpose. If the power of attorney I had signed did not contain that express authorization, the handwritten notes were legally worthless. I didn't have the original signed copy, Consuelo, or the firm had it, but I had the photograph of the annotated copy from the envelope, and that photograph was enough to ask the question I needed Oscar Navarro to answer. I called Oscar the next day from the kitchen landline at 10:30 in the morning, while Consuelo was at the gym where she went on Fridays. It was a number I dialed from memory for over 20 years. Oscar picked up on the third ring. Aurelio, is everything all right? I need to see you, not urgently, but soon. And I needed to be outside your office. There was a brief pause. Oscar Navarro had been in the world for 57 years and practicing as a lawyer for 27. He knew how to distinguish between a courtesy call and a call that required a different kind of attention. I have Tuesday morning free. There's a bar on Calle Ibiza where I sometimes have breakfast near the roundabout. Do you know it? At 10. At 10, I hung up. I wrote down Tuesday in the notebook and put the notebook in a leather briefcase I had carried since my working years and which now lived at the back of the study closet. A briefcase that Consuelo never opened because she had never had any reason to. On Tuesday, I arrived at the bar on Calle Ibiza 15 minutes early. I ordered coffee with milk and waited by the bar. Oscar appeared on time in his dark trench coat, and with that way he had of entering any place, evaluating the space before heading to any specific point. We sat at a table in the back, away from the bar, and the only other occupied table at that hour. I explained everything in the same order I had constructed it in the notebook. The photograph of the envelope, the documents from the shoebox, the power of attorney, the handwritten notes, the receipts from the Sanchez Vega firm. I omitted nothing and added no judgment, just the facts in sequence in the same way I would have presented an appraisal report to a client. Oscar listened without interrupting. When I finished, he ordered another coffee without milk, stirred it once, and left the spoon on the saucer. The power of attorney you signed in 2020. Do you remember if the notary read the full content out loud before you signed? He read it, but I don't remember it including any express authorization for modification of ownership. Then there are two possibilities, said Oscar with the calm of someone who is already calculating while speaking. Either the power of attorney doesn't have the scope for what they are trying to do with it, in which case any attempt at notarial registration would fail automatically, or it has an ambiguous wording that the Sanchez-Vega firm interprets extensively. In that second case, an attempt could be made, although it would be challengeable. I need to see the original. I don't have the original. I can request it from the notary who formalized it with your name and your ID. I have direct access as a legal representative. Give me a week. The moment when almost everything fell apart came 3 days after that conversation. On a Friday afternoon, Gonzalo showed up at the apartment without warning. He brought 2 tickets for a football match on Sunday and said he thought I might like to go out for a while. It was a completely normal gesture in other circumstances, but Gonzalo knew I had the briefcase in the study, and while we were in the living room talking about the match, I saw his gaze linger a second longer than necessary on the ajar door of the study. Just a second, enough for me to register it. I stood up before he could make any move in that direction. Wait a moment. I'm going to get my jacket. I left it in the study the other day, and it's cold these days. I went into the study, closed the door behind me naturally, picked up the jacket from the back of the chair, and in the 10 seconds it took me to put the briefcase under my arm, concealed under the garment, I placed it behind the large file box that was next to the wall, out of direct sight from the door. Then I opened the door and returned to the living room with my jacket on. Cold in March, said Gonzalo with a slight smile. The years don't pass for free, I replied. I accepted the tickets. We went to the match on Sunday. Gonzalo was lively and talkative for the 2 hours it lasted. At no time did he mention anything related to the company, the papers, or any matter that could have a double meaning. Neither did I. When I got home that afternoon, Consuelo was reading in the living room. She asked me how the match had gone. I told her it was good, that they had won by a narrow margin. I went to the kitchen to drink water. I stood for a moment leaning against the counter, looking at the tile opposite that had been there since we bought the apartment, and that Consuelo had never wanted to change because she said she liked the color. 40 years looking at that tile, without knowing what I knew now. Oscar called me on the Thursday of the following week. What he had found in the original of the power of attorney changed the map I had drawn in the notebook in a way I hadn't expected. It wasn't what I thought. It was something worse. The power of attorney has express authorization for acts of disposal. Oscar said it as soon as I sat down in front of him, without preamble or introduction. We had arranged to meet again at the same bar on Calle Ibiza, a week after his call. It was a Thursday in April with the morning sun coming through the large windows of the place and a temperature that hadn't yet decided if it was late winter or early spring. I asked him to repeat it. Acts of disposal, said Oscar. It's not an ordinary management power of attorney. The notary who formalized it drafted it with a scope that goes far beyond what they presented to you as justification. It includes a clause that enables the attorney in fact to carry out property transfers, including real estate, without the need for a new appearance by the principal. I stared at my coffee cup for a few seconds. And that's legal? It's perfectly legal if the person signing knows the full scope of what they're signing. The problem is that if you can prove you signed under a misleading description of the content, under the belief that it was a limited scope instrument, that constitutes a defect of consent. And a defect of consent is sufficient cause for notarial annulment. Can I prove it? Oscar opened the folder he had brought with him, took out 2 sheets of paper, and placed them in front of me. The notary who formalized your power of attorney retired last December, but his archives are still active, and I've had access to the protocol records. The reading record states that he read the content out loud, but there's something that doesn't add up. The date of the record and the date of the copy you signed have a discrepancy of 4 days. Notarial records don't have discrepancies of that type, unless there has been some manipulation in the order of the documents. That's enough, not on its own, But combined with the documents you have photographed, with the receipts from the parallel account, and with the draft of the property division where Gonzalo's signature appears as a witness, it forms a solid set of evidence to file a lawsuit for annulment with real chances. What I need now is for you to come by my office in the next few days and sign the power of representation. From then on, I'll take care of what follows. I put the papers in the inside pocket of my jacket. We left the bar 20 minutes apart. Me first, then him. Back at home, Consuelo was on the terrace with a cup of coffee and the cardigan she wore when the temperature couldn't quite make up its mind. There was something in that image that stopped me for a moment at the threshold of the sliding door. A 60-year-old woman sitting in a chair looking at the neighborhood rooftops with an expression that was neither peaceful nor worried, but something in between that I couldn't name exactly. She hadn't heard me arrive. I watched her for perhaps 10 seconds from inside the living room through the glass, without her knowing I was looking at her. It was just a person with a cup that, by that point, must have been cold. With her gaze fixed on a horizon of antennas and rooftops that was exactly the same as any other day, without the functional composure of daily conversations, without the controlled distance with which she managed any direct interaction, just a lone woman on a terrace on an April morning. Then I remembered something I hadn't remembered in a long time. The day Nura was born, in June 1990, I had arrived at the hospital with my shoes still damp from a technical visit I couldn't cancel in time. I waited in the hallway for almost 5 hours. When they finally let me in, Consuelo was propped up in bed with the baby in her arms. Her hair stuck to her temples from the effort, and an expression I hadn't seen on her before or would see again. Something genuine, without edges, without the usual distance she put between herself and everything that surrounded her. She looked not directly at me, but in the direction where I was standing, and said without raising her voice, "This we did right." It wasn't a compliment or a reproach. It was an observation of the kind someone makes when they see something that exceeds their own expectations, and they don't know exactly what to do with that surprise. It lasted a moment. Then she looked back at Nura and didn't add anything else. Memory doesn't choose its moments with any criterion of convenience. It gives you back what it gives you back when it feels like it, regardless of whether you need it or would rather not receive it. And what it gave me back that morning in front of the terrace glass was that moment in the hospital, that phrase said to no one in particular, and the uncomfortable certainty that at that moment something between the two of us had been real, whatever it was, and that this reality didn't erase what came after, but it also didn't disappear because it was inconvenient to remember it now. There are things that can't be eliminated by willpower. That's the cost that no one mentions when talking about betrayals that last for decades. That the years that were worth something and the years that weren't coexist in the same place, and that when you extract the latter for examination, the former appear uninvited. I asked myself that morning, with an honesty I owed to no one but myself, if my own absences had built the ground on which Consuelo built what she built. The nights I came home late without any warning, the weekends at work absorbed from beginning to end. The conversations that always stayed on the surface because going deeper required an effort I didn't want to make at the time. I was responsible for all of that, and naming it was neither weakness nor excuse. It was simply saying what had happened without embellishing it. But it's one thing to build distance through emotional negligence, which is a human error one can carry and acknowledge. And it's something completely different to plan for years the methodical dispossession of someone who sleeps in the same room. Those two things don't belong in the same category, and mixing them to make what I had to do more bearable would have been the only real way to lose in all of this. I went out onto the terrace. "How has your morning been?" asked Consuelo, without turning completely. "A coffee and a short walk. The weather is holding up." I sat in the other chair. The wind gently moved the awning's flap, without fully unfurling it. "Do you want me to make something for lunch?" "I'll take care of it. There are steaks in the fridge." The conversation lasted as long as it lasted. Then Consuelo went into the kitchen, and I stayed a moment longer on the terrace looking at the same horizon she had been looking at. I found nothing particular in it, just the arbitrary order of the Madrid rooftops under a sky that was beginning to cloud over from the west. What came next was a different kind of work. Oscar and I met in his office 3 days later. I signed the power of representation that made him my legal representative for this specific matter. And from that moment on, the process entered a different phase, more technical, more backed by formal documents, less dependent on my direct observation skills, and more reliant on the instruments that Oscar knew how to handle with the same precision with which I had handled those of my own profession for 30 years. The first thing he did was to formally request the review of the notarial protocol of the power of attorney, citing the date discrepancy he had detected. It wasn't a legal action yet. It was a preventive move, a formal registration of the anomaly that established a documented precedent before any other party could execute anything. The second was to review with me the status of each property from a registration point of view. We accessed the corresponding property registry together and verified that none of the ownerships had been modified. The transfers that the Sanchez-Vega draft described had not been executed. The power of attorney existed, the plan existed, but the final step had not been taken. That gave us some leeway, not much, but enough. How long can it take for them to try to move it? I asked. It depends on when they consider the time is right. If they wait for a formal separation to be initiated, some documents become more difficult to execute without your knowledge. They will probably want to act before you officially start anything. My recommendation is that we get ahead of them. How? By revoking the power of attorney. It's a unilateral act that doesn't require Consuelo's presence or consent. You sign the instrument, you can cancel it. We do it before a notary. We register it in the protocol. And from that moment on, any attempt to use it is invalidated at its very source. I told them I would think about it over the weekend, not because I had any doubts about doing it, but because I needed that step to be irreversible and I wanted to be completely sure of the correct order of moves before executing any. It was during that same weekend that the most compromised moment of the last few months arrived without warning. On Saturday afternoon, Gonzalo showed up with the children to spend a few hours. His wife Elena had gone to see her mother, and he took the opportunity to bring the little ones to visit their grandparents. It was a common occurrence, with nothing unusual on the surface. The children went straight to the living room. Consuelo brought out cookies. I put on cartoons on the television, and the afternoon took on that noisy, messy texture of hours with young grandchildren. At one point, Gonzalo asked me to find the invoice for the last maintenance of the boiler at the Guadalajara house. He said he wanted to compare the provider with one he had found that was cheaper for the summer checkup. It was a request that in any other circumstance would have had no hidden layer. The problem was that the invoice was filed in the Guadalajara folder, which I kept in the same desk drawer where Consuelo had kept the Sanchez-Vega envelope. I had returned that envelope to its place weeks ago, but in the process, I had slightly reorganized the order of the folders to document it before and after. If Gonzalo opened that drawer with the excuse of the invoice and remembered the order he had seen on a previous visit to the study, any difference could become a difficult problem to control. I didn't tell him to look for it himself. "I'll get it for you now," I said, getting up before he made any move. "Give me 2 minutes." I went into the study, closed the door naturally, opened the drawer, took out the Guadalajara folder directly, found the invoice, and returned to the living room without Gonzalo having set foot in that room. He read it, said the price seemed reasonable after all, and didn't mention the topic again for the rest of the afternoon. The children left with their father at 8. I washed the glasses in the kitchen looking at the building's inner courtyard, while the evening light changed angle on the walls. The following Monday at 11 in the morning, I signed a revocation of the power of attorney before a notary, with Oscar present as a witness of my representation. Consuelo didn't know it yet, and what she also didn't know was that Oscar had found something else when reviewing the notarial protocol. A specific piece of information about the real origin of this whole process that altered the timeline of when the plan had begun to be built. It wasn't in 2019 that Consuelo had taken the first step. It was earlier, much earlier. Oscar placed a sheet of paper on the table with a single underlined line and turned it towards me so I could read it. It was a date, March 15th, 2016. "That's what I found in the notary's protocol," he said. "A preliminary consultation registered in the appointment book in the name of Consuelo Ramos Medina about the legal scope of powers of attorney for acts of disposal. It wasn't a formalization consultation. It was an informational one. It didn't generate any documents, only a record of visit, but the date is from 2016. I looked at the sheet without saying anything for a few seconds, a year after I transferred the company's shares to Gonzalo. The same year we had celebrated 33 years of marriage in a neighborhood restaurant with the children and the first grandchildren who were already walking. The same year Nura gave me a framed photograph of the Guadalajara house in summer because she knew that place mattered to me more than any other material thing we had. That means she's been building this for more than 7 years, I said. At least consulting. The active process with the Sanchez Vega firm and the separate account started in 2019 according to the receipts you found. But the intention, or at least the exploration of the intention, comes from before. I put the folded sheet in my jacket pocket along with the other documents I had been accumulating over the past few months. Oscar picked up his folder with that calm, methodical movement he had for everything. He closed the clasp and rested his elbows on the table. Aurelio, the revocation has been registered since Monday. The assets are protected. Whatever comes now, however it comes, it has no legal basis to prosper. I want you to understand that in strictly legal terms, you've already won. I know. So, what's left is to decide when and how you let her know. I didn't answer immediately. Outside the office, Calle Serrano had that particular noise of weekday mornings in spring. Cars, a distant horn, conversations passing by without stopping. The anniversary is in October, I said. Finally. Consuelo has been insisting for weeks on celebrating it at a restaurant with the children and some friends. I'm not going to cancel it. Oscar looked at me with an expression that wasn't exactly surprise, but it wasn't approval or disapproval either. It was the expression of a man who has learned to listen without interfering in decisions that are not his to make. Are you sure? Completely. Why I didn't tell Oscar, because it wasn't necessary to explain, was the reasoning behind that decision. It wasn't a gesture of cruelty or a deliberate trap. It was simply the logic of someone who had spent 3 decades appraising the real value of things. If Consuelo had built an internal narrative about that marriage for years, if she had come to believe that the anniversary was the right time to execute something she had been preparing for a long time, the most honest decision was not to deprive her of that moment, to let what was going to happen, happen. The outcome no longer depended on what she did that night. The months between that conversation with Oscar and October passed with a normality that at times I found almost strange for its own consistency. Consuelo organized the details of the dinner with the same efficiency with which she organized everything. The restaurant in the Chimberry neighborhood, where we had eaten a few times on special occasions, the reservation for 12 people, the menu agreed upon with the manager, the calls to the friends she wanted to be present. I agreed to every detail without any resistance. In August, I went to Guadalajara to check on the country house before the end of summer, as I usually did. I spent 3 days there alone. I checked the boiler, inspected the roof. After the July rains, I walked around the property for a whole afternoon with no specific purpose other than to be in a place I had known since I was a child and that still smelled the same as when my parents lived in it. It was in Guadalajara, where I had the only night in recent months when the determination I had so carefully built showed a real crack. It was past 11. I was sitting in the kitchen of the house with a glass of water on the table and the terrace door open to let in the August air, which in Guadalajara at night has a different density than in Madrid, drier, with the smell of hot earth cooling slowly. I wasn't thinking about anything in particular, or rather, I was thinking about everything without being able to stop at any specific point. 40 years was not an abstract number. It was a concrete texture made of thousands of mornings, of cold dinners and hot dinners, of paid bills and forgotten bills, of hospitals and waits, of the particular sounds a house has when 2 people inhabit it for long enough for every creak of the floor to have a predictable schedule. All of that had existed. All of that still existed in some way, even though I could no longer place it in any order that made sense. I thought of Nura, of how she was going to receive what I had to tell her. Nura had had no part in any of this, and yet she was going to bear the weight of discovering it. Because children always bear the weight of what their parents discover, even if they haven't done anything. I stayed in that kitchen until after midnight. Then I closed the terrace door, turned off the light, and went to bed. The next morning, with the Guadalajara sun coming in horizontally through the wooden blinds, I got up at 7, made coffee, and checked the roof again because one of the gutters had seemed misplaced the day before. I fixed it myself with the tools from the shed. It took me 2 hours. When I finished, my hands were dirty and my back was a bit sore, and I felt clearer than I had all week. The crack from the previous night was still there. It would remain, but it didn't change what I had to do. Back in Madrid, in the weeks leading up to the anniversary, I observed something I hadn't anticipated. Consuelo was tense. Not obviously or detectably, so to someone who didn't know her well, but I had been in the same house for 40 years and knew how to distinguish her states with the same precision with which I distinguished the state of structure showing fatigue. Even if from the outside it still seemed solid. She was sleeping less. I noticed it because the light on her nightstand stayed on until hours when it would normally be off. Some mornings, she had that particular expression of someone who has spent several hours making decisions in silence and has reached a conclusion that they are not yet ready to share. I don't know what she was thinking. I don't have access to that, nor do I pretend to. What I do know is that at some point during those weeks, Consuelo made the decision to do what she did at the restaurant that night, and that decision was hers without me forcing it, without any external circumstance precipitating it. It was a choice. The week of the anniversary, the Tuesday before the Saturday dinner, I had the last compromising moment of that entire period. Consuelo asked me to review the list of confirmed guests with her to make sure the restaurant had the correct number of chairs. We sat at the living room table with the printed list between us. It was completely routine. But while we were reviewing the list, Consuelo's phone vibrated on the table and the screen lit up for a moment before she picked it up. I managed to see the contact's name before she turned off the screen. Sanchez Vega, the law firm. 4 days before the anniversary. I didn't change my expression. I didn't move a muscle in my face that shouldn't move. I kept looking at the guest list and pointed out that the reservation number Consuelo had given was 11 and that with Elena, who had confirmed that morning, it would be 12. Consuelo took the phone, stood up naturally, and said she was going to the kitchen to get water. She answered the call with the kitchen door ajar and spoke for no more than 3 minutes. When she returned, she put the phone in her pocket and corrected the reservation number on the list. "All in order," she said. "All in order," I repeated. What Sanchez Vega had told her in that call. I couldn't know for sure, but I could deduce it with considerable accuracy. If Consuelo was still in contact with the firm 4 days before the dinner, it was because the plan was still active from her perspective. She didn't yet know that the power of attorney had been revoked in April. She didn't yet know that the documents she kept in the blue box had been photographed and were in the hands of my legal representative. She didn't yet know absolutely anything about what had happened in recent months. From her point of view, she was going to the restaurant on Saturday with full control of the situation in her hands. On Saturday, I arrived at the restaurant at 9:05. I sat in my place, greeted each person by name, ordered the usual wine. I spent the first 20 minutes with the grandchildren, which is how long they last sitting down before needing to move. I talked with the friends Consuelo had invited about things that mattered in that context. The theater season, the heat in September, the renovation of the neighborhood square that had been unfinished for 2 years. Consuelo was at the other end of the table. I observed her once discreetly. She had a glass of white wine in her hand and was talking with Elena with an animation that was not her usual register. There was something in that energy, in that slight acceleration of her gestures, that I recognized as the tension of someone who is about to do something they have been preparing for a long time. I didn't expect it for that night. I say that with honesty. I thought the formal separation would come after the anniversary, in the following days or weeks, with a private conversation and the papers from the Sanchez Vega firm as backup. I didn't anticipate that Consuelo would choose that moment, that table, that specific audience to do it the way she did. When she stood up and tapped her glass with a spoon, the first thing I thought was that she was going to make a toast. What she said was something else. And what happened at that table in the seconds that followed her words The way 8 pairs of eyes turned towards me at the same time, Nuria's face falling apart, and above all, that gesture of Gonzalo lowering his gaze to his plate instead of looking at me. That specific gesture of someone who already knew what was going to be said and has no argument with which to face it. All of that settled somewhere inside me, with a clarity that needed no further interpretation. I stood up, took the glass, made a toast alone in silence, looking straight ahead. I took the exact amount of money for the wine out of my pocket, placed it on the tablecloth carefully so it wouldn't fall, and left. What no one at that table could know as they watched me walk through the restaurant door was that night, before I went to sleep, I was going to make 2 calls, one to Oscar, and another that would change Gonzalo's situation in a way he couldn't yet imagine. I slept that night with the window ajar. It wasn't a deep or restful sleep, but it wasn't the kind of insomnia that consumes you either. It was a functional rest of the kind someone has when they have finished carrying something heavy and the body still remembers the effort, even though the load is no longer there. At 7:15, I got up, made coffee, drank it standing by the kitchen window, watching how the October light entered obliquely between the buildings opposite. At 9:04, the bank sent the notification to Consuelo. I know this with that precision because Oscar had confirmed to me the night before when I called him from the car park 2 blocks from the restaurant that the blocking order executed on the joint account and the cards associated with her ownership would take effect first thing the next morning. The bank was the only messenger. That had been a deliberate decision, not a message from me, not a letter, not a call, an automatic notification from a financial institution as impersonal and definitive as she had planned her own move to be. Consuelo called my phone at 9:16. I let it ring. She called again at 9:22. The same. The third call came at 9:41. I didn't answer any of them. It wasn't a gesture of hostility. It was simply that I had nothing to say to her that hadn't already been said or that wouldn't be said better through the channels that Oscar had set in motion. Conversations between people at that point in a situation like this rarely produce anything useful. They produce noise, and noise only benefits those who need time to reorganize. I finished my coffee, went to the study, took the notebook with the map I had built over the previous months from the briefcase, and reviewed it one last time from beginning to end, not because I needed to confirm any data, but because it was the logical conclusion to something that had started with an observation and ended with complete documentation. I closed it, put it away, and left it on the desk. That same morning I called Nuria. She answered on the second ring with that voice she has when she knows something isn't right before anyone tells her. A sensitivity she had always had and that I had never fully appreciated while I was too busy with other things. Dad, last night I don't know what to say. You don't have to say anything yet. I need you to come to Madrid when you can. Not urgently, but soon. There are things you need to know. And I'd rather tell you in person. There was a pause. Are you okay? I'm fine, really. Another shorter pause. I can on Thursday, the morning avenue. Thursday is fine. I hung up and stood for a moment with the phone in my hand. Then I placed it on the desk next to the notebook and went to get my jacket. The second call that night had been to Gonzalo, not to talk, just to leave him a 3-line text message to come to the office on Monday at 11, that it was important that he should come alone. Gonzalo didn't reply to the message that night. He did the next day. On Sunday morning with a brief, "I'll be there," that added nothing more. On Monday, I arrive at Oscar's office at 10:40. Oscar was already inside with the folder prepared on the table. The Sanchez Vega draft with Gonzalo's signature, the photographs of the receipts from the blue box, the report on the discrepancy in the notarial protocol, the record of the revocation of the power of attorney registered in April, and the document for the transfer of company shares signed by Oscar on my behalf that same morning, which transferred 30% of the appraisal company's shares to Nuria Medina Ramos. Everything in order, everything in its folder, everything with a date and signature. Gonzalo arrived at 11:03, buzzed the intercom normally, came up. When he entered the office and saw Oscar sitting on one side of the table and the document spread out in front of the chair that was meant for him, something changed in his expression for a fraction of a second before he composed himself again. He sat down. I didn't say anything for the first few seconds. I let the silence in that room do what silences do when there's no noise to justify them. Then I placed the Sanchez Vega draft in front of him, open to the second page with his signature visible in the bottom margin. Gonzalo lowered his eyes to the paper, raised them, looked at me. I still didn't say anything. I put the photographs of the receipts from the blue box next to it, arranged chronologically 2019, 2020, 2021, 2022. For years of payments to a law firm from an account I didn't know about. Then Oscar's report on the notarial discrepancy. Then the copy of the power of attorney with the handwritten notes. Gonzalo looked at each document without touching it. His breathing was controlled. His hands were still on his knees. It was the composure of someone who has mentally rehearsed this moment for long enough not to break down in front of it, but who also doesn't have the confidence of someone who knows they can win what comes next. "Dad," he said finally. His voice was low and careful. "This isn't what it looks like." Gonzalo, just his name, without any particular inflection. He waited. "I've spent 30 years of my life evaluating documents, contracts, deeds, reports, expert opinions. I've seen all the ways in which papers can say one thing and mean another. These papers say exactly what they mean. Your signature is in the margin of a draft property division prepared by a firm your mother hired in secret with money from an account I didn't know about. That signature isn't decorative." Gonzalo opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. "I was trying to protect the family," he said. "Mom hadn't been well for years. She felt the marriage was suffocating her, and I just wanted there to be order when the time came, so it wouldn't be a disaster for everyone. Protect the family." I repeated the words without changing my tone. "You put your signature as a witness on documents designed to divert 40% of the real value of what I built over 40 years for me. That's not protecting anyone. That's choosing a side and working for it while looking me in the eye at every dinner." Gonzalo didn't answer. There was something in his silence that wasn't exactly regret, but it wasn't just defensiveness either. It was the buried recognition that appears when there are no more layers left to cover it. "In 2015, I transferred 30% of the company's shares to you as a gift for your 30th birthday. I continued, with no strings attached, no retribution contract, no demands of any kind, just the pride of a father who wanted his son to have something concrete and built. This morning, those shares have been transferred to your sister's name. The instrument is signed and registered." Gonzalo raised his head. "The apartment on Calle Bravo Murillo that you've been occupying for 4 years with the rent I pay is to be vacated within 30 days. As of the 31st, the contract will not be renewed and the management will be handled by Oscar." The silence that followed was different from the previous one, denser, with a specific weight that we both recognized without needing to name it. Gonzalo took a deep breath through his nose. When he spoke, his voice had a different texture, lower, almost without volume. "And that's it." I got up from my chair, picked up the folder, and gave it to Oscar. I put on my jacket, and before opening the office door, I turned to my son one last time. "You learned the price of everything and the value of nothing. Now you're going to discover what it costs to build with your own hands, just like I did." I opened the door and walked out into the hallway. I didn't hear any response behind me. I didn't expect one. On Thursday, Nura arrived on the 1015 Avenue. I picked her up at Atacha. We went for breakfast at a cafe in the Barrio de las Letras, which she liked since she lived in Madrid. We ordered 2 coffees with milk and a toast each. I told her everything she needed to know. The documents, the power of attorney, the receipts, Gonzalo's signature, the decisions I had made. I told it in the same order I had always told it, without emotional excesses and without omitting anything she had a right to know. Nura listened without interrupting. When I finished, her eyes were moist for a moment that she let pass before speaking. "How long have you known?" "Since February 2022. I had been working in silence for a year and a half before the restaurant thing happened. And you still went. Everything was already done. What happened that night didn't change anything I had built." Nura was quiet for a few seconds, looking at her cup. "And Gonzalo?" "Gonzalo made a decision, and he'll have to live with the consequences of that decision. It's not something for you to manage. I just wanted you to know the truth before it reached you in any other way." I also explained about the company's shares, that they were now hers, that it wasn't a symbolic gesture, but a real one, with complete documentation, and that if she didn't want to have anything to do with the company, she was completely free to sell or transfer them as she saw fit. That it was her decision, not mine. Nura took a moment to answer. Dad, I don't want that if it comes from this. It doesn't come from this. It comes from the fact that you're the only person in this story who didn't choose badly when you had a chance. And that has value. She didn't add anything else for a while. We finished breakfast with a calmer conversation about Zaragoza, about the plan she had with Marcos, about things that had no relation to what we had just talked about, and yet were necessary because life doesn't stop in difficult moments, even if it sometimes seems to. When she left to take the avenue back in the afternoon, we said goodbye at the cafe door. She hugged me longer than usual. I didn't say anything, neither did she. I watched her walk away down the street, and then I walked home. That afternoon, sitting at the study desk, with the October light coming through the window, I opened the bottom drawer where the car insurance, the deeds, and Consuelo's envelope had been for years. The drawer was empty, except for the documents that had always been mine. I closed it. I thought about the blue shoebox that had been in the hallway closet for years. Consuelo had taken it with her when she collected her things 3 days after the anniversary, on a Wednesday morning, while I was at Oscar's office. She notified me by message that she would come to pick up what was necessary and that the rest would be handled through a lawyer. I replied that it was fine, that Oscar was my representative for any formal communication. There were no more messages after that. What was in that box no longer had any practical value. The power of attorney was revoked. The Sanchez-Vega documents had lost all their legal scope since April. The receipts from a parallel account that I already knew about didn't give her any advantage in any process. She could take the box. What it contained was now just paper. I opened the notebook to the last page where I had written the map of the assets. Below the columns of numbers and dates, in the bottom margin, there was a line I had written at some point in the last few months and that I didn't remember writing deliberately. What is built with one's own hands cannot be undone by anyone with a piece of paper. It wasn't a philosophical conclusion. It was simply the technical observation of someone who has spent decades evaluating the real value of things, and who knows that there is a fundamental difference between what can be appraised in a document and what admits no formal valuation because it belongs to a different category. I thought about the glass of wine I had raised alone at the Chambéry restaurant in front of 12 people who were looking at me, expecting me to break down. It hadn't been a theatrical gesture or a declaration of anything. It had simply been the most honest way I found at that moment to close something that had already been closed long before Consuelo stood up. 40 years, a glass raised alone, and the next morning the only response that made sense to give. I put the notebook in the briefcase, closed the clasp with the same click as always, and went to the kitchen to prepare dinner. It was a Thursday in October with the Madrid sky clear and cold, and I was 63 years old and hungry, and that was exactly what there was. The envelope arrived on a Tuesday in November by registered mail. I picked it up from the mailbox first thing before going up to make breakfast. It had the letterhead of the Sanchez-Vega y Asociados law firm in the upper left corner and my name written with the office printer that law firms use for formal correspondence. I didn't open it in the lobby. I took it up to the apartment, left it on the kitchen table, made coffee, served it, and only then, sitting with the cup in front of me, did I slip my finger under the envelope's seal and open it. It was a formal communication of 2 pages. It informed, on behalf of its client, Consuelo Ramos Medina, of the intention to initiate a marital separation process. It requested my agreement to manage the procedure by mutual consent and attached a preliminary proposal for the division of assets that Sanchez-Vega presented as an equitable basis for negotiation. The proposal was the same one I had seen photographed in the documents from the drawer, the 2 Madrid apartments, and the Guadalajara house for Consuelo. A financial compensation for me, calculated on the depressed valuations that the firm itself had commissioned. The same scheme from September 2021 presented now as if it were a new and reasonable proposal. The only difference was that this time it came with an official letterhead and a conciliatory tone. What the Sanchez-Vega firm didn't know yet, or if they did, they didn't mention it in that letter, was that the power of attorney that supported their entire strategy had been revoked 6 months earlier, and that the revocation had been registered in the notarial protocol since April. I called Oscar at 10 in the morning. "I already have it," he said when I answered. "A copy arrived at my office an hour ago. They're activating the mutual agreement process to try to close before you get to a contentious procedure. It's the logical move when they think they have control of the situation. Well, they find out they don't. When we respond, I propose we do it before Friday." A formal letter from my office notifying the revocation of the power of attorney, attaching the registered record, and informing them that any proposal for the division of assets must be based on updated and independent market valuations. With that, the proposal they've sent you has no ground. Do it. You'll have it signed this afternoon. I hung up and finished the coffee that had gotten lukewarm while I was reading. I didn't feel satisfaction at that moment. I felt something more like the confirmation of something I already knew, that the solidity of what you build is measured precisely in the moments when someone tries to move it and can't. The building that Consuelo and Sanchez Vega had erected for years had a single main beam, which was the power of attorney, and that beam had been removed for 6 months. What they were left with was the facade. Oscar sent the formal response on Thursday. The reaction from the Sanchez Vega firm took 4 days to arrive. It came on a Monday morning, also by registered letter, with a notably different tone from the first communication, less conciliatory, more technical, exploring the possibility of questioning the validity of the revocation for procedural reasons that Oscar dismissed in 10 minutes of reading. It was the move of a firm that had built a strategy for years on an instrument that no longer existed and was now looking for any possible crack in the opposing documentation. There were none. Oscar explained it to me in a brief meeting at the end of November with that particular serenity he has when the ground is completely clear. The revocation is unassailable. It was done before a competent notary on a date prior to any attempt to use the instrument and with proper protocol registration. They have no way in. What they're going to do now is recalibrate their strategy and propose a division based on what they can actually claim in an ordinary separation procedure. And what can they really claim? 50% of the community property, no more, no less. If there are separate assets of yours from before the marriage, those are left out. The Guadalajara house, which was an inheritance from your parents and never entered the community property regime because you received it before you got married, and we have it documented, is not part of the division. And the apartments, both in Madrid, are community property. They are divided, but with the real valuations, not with the one Sanchez Vega had fabricated. The difference between their figures and mine is almost 400,000 euros in the total calculation. That's the margin they were losing with their original plan and that you recover with the revocation. I left Oscar's office that afternoon with the same jacket as always and the same leather briefcase I had carried since my working years. I walked home because the day was cold, but without rain, and because I needed that 40-minute journey with no intermediate destination. What happened 10 days later, I did not anticipate. Gonzalo showed up at the building's entrance on a Wednesday afternoon. He didn't call beforehand. He just appeared and buzzed the intercom. I recognized his voice in the first second. "Dad, I need to talk to you." I didn't answer immediately. I took the 3 seconds it took to think what I had to think. That letting Gonzalo in at that moment, before the legal process was completely closed and documented, was to introduce a variable I didn't control into a scenario that had been predictable and manageable for months. "It's not the right time, Gonzalo. Just 10 minutes. It's not the right time." Silence on the intercom for several seconds. Mom is pressuring Sanchez Vega to change the strategy. She told me herself. I think you need to know what she's planning. I stood still by the intercom with my hand still on the device. It was possible that Gonzalo was telling the truth. It was equally possible that Consuelo or the firm itself had sent him to get information about what I knew or about the strength of Oscar's position. That kind of move was not unusual in separation processes, where one of the parties believes the other may have weaknesses they haven't formally declared. Talk to Oscar Navarro. He's my representative. Everything you have to tell me comes through him. "Dad, good afternoon, Gonzalo." I released the intercom, walked away from the hall, and went to the living room. I sat in the armchair that I had occupied in that same spot for 40 years and listened as the building's entrance fell silent on the floor below. There were no more calls on the intercom. I called Oscar that same night to tell him what had happened. He listened attentively. You did the right thing. If Gonzalo has real information about a change in the firm's strategy, let him communicate it to me formally. If they have nothing concrete and he just wanted to get into the apartment, you've just avoided a mistake. What kind of change in strategy could Consuelo be planning? Several possibilities. The most likely is that they'll try to question the real date of the breakup to claim assets that would strictly belong to the earlier period. They could also try to incorporate the company shares you transferred to Nura into the process, arguing that the transfer was motivated by the conflict. For that, they would need to prove that it was done in fraud of creditors, which is very difficult to sustain given that the transfer is documented before the formal start of any process. So, it's a pressure tactic, probably, but I want to verify it before Monday. Let me make some inquiries. I hung up and stayed in the living room with the light on and the silence of the empty apartment, which was a different silence than before, not heavier or lighter, just different, the kind of space as when the person who inhabited it has gone and the air has taken a while to redistribute. Oscar verified what he needed to verify for the rest of the week. On Friday, he called me with the information. Consuelo and Sanchez Vega had changed their collaborating lawyer. They had brought in a specialist in property litigation from a different, larger firm, also based on Calle Serrano. It wasn't a replacement for Sanchez Vega, but a lateral addition, which meant that someone had evaluated the situation and concluded that the case profile required technical reinforcement. Does that complicate anything? I asked. It lengthens the process and makes it more expensive for both parties, but it doesn't change the legal basis. What it can change is the procedural tactic. The new lawyer has a reputation for working with his own expert appraisers who produce alternative valuations to the markets. They're going to try to challenge my valuations of the properties with partisan reports. I spent 30 years doing exactly that in reverse, coming in after the partisan experts and proving before a notary and a judge that their figures didn't hold up. I know all the arguments they're going to use. Oscar paused briefly. That's exactly what we need to document. I want you to prepare a technical valuation report for the 3 properties with complete methodology, verifiable market sources, and comparisons of real transactions in the same areas in the last 12 months with your signature as a certified property appraiser. That makes your own name the strongest argument we have. Give me 2 weeks. Take 3 if you need them. Make it perfect. I hung up and went to the study. I took out my notebook, opened a new page, and started writing the report's index. It was work I knew by heart, work I had done hundreds of times over 30 years, but this time it had a different weight because the property I was appraising was the result of a lifetime, and the recipient of the report was a process that was going to determine what part of that life remained mine. I worked for 3 hours without getting up from the chair. At 11 at night, I put the notebook away and turned off the desk light. Before going to sleep, I checked my phone. There was a message from Nura sent that afternoon for Zaragoza. I called Gonzalo. He told me he went to the building entrance. Are you okay? I replied with 3 words. Completely fine, honey. I left the phone on the nightstand and stared at the ceiling for a moment. 3 weeks for the report. A legal process that was going to extend for several more months, and a new lawyer for Consuelo whose name I still hadn't been able to review, filed under a reference code that didn't correspond to the main separation file, but to a different number, as if it belonged to a parallel matter that had not yet been formally linked to the process. Oscar had said he would look at it on Monday. Monday had not yet arrived. The parallel document is a lawsuit for unjust enrichment. Oscar said it without preamble as soon as I answered the phone on Monday at 9:30 in the morning. I was in the study with the valuation report spread out on the desk, 3 pages full of technical notes and market comparisons that I had been reviewing since 8. I put the pen down on the table. Explain. The lawsuit is filed by Consuelo independently of the separation process, but linked to it. The argument is that during 40 years of marriage, she contributed unpaid domestic work, household management, and the renunciation of her own professional career, all of which enabled your professional development and the accumulation of the current assets. They allege that this contribution is not reflected in the community property regime because its nature is not directly economic, but one of ceded opportunity, and they are requesting additional compensation based on this differential enrichment. I didn't answer for several seconds. Is it legally viable? In Spain, there is Article 1438 of the Civil Code, which recognizes the right to compensation for the spouse who work for the household. There is also jurisprudence from the Supreme Court that has expanded this recognition in cases of long marriages where domestic dedication was exclusive or majoritarian. The viability depends on the specific facts and how they are proven. Consuelo did not renounce any professional career. She worked as a teacher for 14 years before taking a voluntary leave of absence in 1997. The leave was her decision, not an imposition. I know, and that's a strong argument in your favor. But the mere fact that there are 14 years after that leave in which she managed the household and the children while you built the professional assets is enough for a judge to consider the claim on its merits. Not necessarily to grant it, but to process it. I got up from the chair and went to the window. The November sky over Madrid had that flat, uniform color of windless days, without defined clouds, without any element for the eye to rest on. How much are they claiming? 180,000 euros. The figure was precise and not small. It wasn't a number fabricated to create psychological pressure. It was a figure calculated on real criteria, which meant that someone with real technical knowledge had worked on that number. When did they file it? The registration date is last Wednesday, 2 days after my office sent the formal response, notifying the revocation of the power of attorney. It's a direct reaction to losing the main instrument. They've opened a second front because the first one no longer works for them, and the new lawyer they brought in is the one signing this. He's the lead counsel for this specific lawsuit. Sanchez Vega remains as representative in the ordinary separation process. It's a coordinated dual-front structure. It's not improvisation. I sat back down at the desk. The pages of the valuation report were still spread out with the notes in pen. I looked at them for a moment without reading them. There was something in that lawsuit that I couldn't simply process as just another legal move. Not because it was surprising in terms of tactics, but because part of the argument was true. Consuelo had managed the household for years with an efficiency that I had never questioned precisely because it worked, and that efficiency had had a real cost for her, even if I hadn't recognized it then, nor had I recognized it later. That didn't justify what she had planned, but it also didn't disappear because it was inconvenient to acknowledge it now. What do you need from me to respond? I asked. 3 things. First, the documents for the voluntary leave of absence from 1997, which prove that the decision was hers and not derived from any external circumstance. Second, any record of Consuelo's own income during the marriage, beyond her teacher's salary, inheritances, sale of her own property, anything that shows she was not exclusively financially dependent. Third, documented testimony that her living conditions during the marriage were proportional to the assets being built, not of deprivation. For the first, I have the leave papers in the file. For the third, I have 20 years of bank statements showing the level of family spending. For the second, I'll have to check, but I remember that in 2003, she received an inheritance from her father that she deposited in her personal account. We'll work with that. Bring me everything you have before Thursday. I hung up and remained seated for a moment with my hands clasped on the desk, looking at the space between the pages of the report. Then I opened the right-hand drawer of the file cabinet and started looking. The following days, I dedicated to archival work that I hadn't done in years, reviewing folder by folder, statement by statement, the complete financial documentation of the marriage from 1983 to the present. It was a considerable volume of paper accumulated over decades, in which renovation invoices, insurance contracts, tax settlements, and receipts for expenses that at the time had seemed too small to deserve attention and which now acquired documentary relevance coexisted. I found the leave of absence papers in a folder labeled with the year 1997. It was a voluntary request with Consuelo's signature, with no attached document indicating pressure or external conditioning. I also found the inheritance declaration from 2003. Her father had passed away that year, leaving her and her 2 sisters the contents of a savings account that was distributed in equal parts. Consuelo's share had been 42,000 euros, deposited into her personal account 2 months after his death. I took everything to Oscar's office on Thursday, with a folder organized by date and a table of contents on the first page, just as I would have presented any technical documentation in my active working years. Oscar reviewed it for 20 minutes without saying anything, then closed it and placed the folder on the table. This considerably reduces the scope of the lawsuit. The inheritance proves her own financial capacity. The voluntary nature of the leave eliminates the argument of forced renunciation. What remains is the period of domestic management after 1997, which is real, but which also has to be valued based on the standard of living she actually enjoyed, not a situation of deprivation that didn't exist. How much can still stand? In the best-case scenario for them, a judge could award moderate compensation for the period after the leave. In the most likely scenario with the documentation you have, the lawsuit is reduced to an amount significantly lower than the 180 euros 000 they are requesting, possibly between 30 euros 000 and 50 euros 000, which is the range where these cases are usually settled when there is complete documentation from both parties. And if we don't want to go to trial? Oscar looked at me with the expression of someone who expects the question to have something more behind it. It depends on what you're willing to offer to close this without further proceedings. I didn't answer immediately. What I was evaluating was not just the financial cost, but the cost in time and energy of a litigation process that could extend for months or years without the final result being substantially different from settlement. Now, this was exactly the kind of calculation I had learned to do at work. The technically optimal result was not always the rationally correct result when all the real variables were included in the equation, not just the numerical ones. Let me think about it over the weekend. Take as much time as you need, but keep in mind that the deadline to formally respond to the lawsuit is next Friday. I left the office in the mid-afternoon with the sky already darkening over the buildings of Calle Serrano. I walked toward the metro with my hands in my jacket pockets and the briefcase slung over my shoulder. What happened on the Friday of that week was something I hadn't anticipated in any of my calculations. Oscar had summoned me to review the draft response to the enrichment lawsuit before the final signing. I arrived at the office at 11. The secretary showed me directly into the small meeting room, the one Oscar used for meetings of fewer than 3 people. When I opened the door, Oscar was sitting opposite me, and on the other side of the table, with a closed folder in front of him and an expression that mixed discomfort with determination, was Consuelo's new lawyer. I wasn't expecting him, and in the second it took me to process what I was seeing, my external reaction was exactly the same as I would have had in any other ordinary professional situation. I entered, greeted the lawyer with a nod, sat next to Oscar, and waited. Mr. Fuentes has requested an informal meeting prior to the formal response to explore the possibility of an out-of-court settlement, said Oscar in a perfectly neutral tone. I informed him that the decision is yours and that you could be present if you deemed it convenient. I decided to notify you with just enough time so that you wouldn't have the opportunity to prepare anything other than your real judgment. It was the kind of move Oscar made when he wanted me to enter something without prior filters. I knew it well. I nodded. Lawyer Fuentes was about 50 years old, a navy blue tie in that way of speaking that litigation lawyers have who have spent enough years in courtrooms to measure every syllable before pronouncing it. He spoke for about 8 minutes, setting out the central arguments of the lawsuit in correct, unexaggerated technical language. Then he proposed a settlement figure, 110,000 euros, as an out-of-court compensation for the enrichment lawsuit in exchange for the definitive closure of that specific process. When he finished, he looked at me, expecting a reaction. Before I could respond, Fuentes added something he hadn't mentioned in the previous 8 minutes, with a naturalness that was not accidental. We would also like to better understand the context of the transfer of company shares made in favor of your daughter, given that its registration date could be relevant to assess the full scope of the available assets. It was the question they had been wanting to ask for weeks. A question that if I answered imprecisely or with any detail that didn't exactly match the documentation Oscar had, could open a line of questioning about whether the transfer to Nura had been motivated by the marital conflict. I answered before Oscar could intervene. The transfer of shares to my daughter is documented with a date prior to the start of any formal process in response to a family planning decision I made in the context of my retirement. The instrument is in the hands of my legal representative and is available for any procedural review that may be appropriate. For any additional questions on that matter, the channel is Oscar Navarro's office. Fuentes noted something in his notepad without changing his expression. Of course, he added nothing more on that point. The meeting ended 20 minutes later without any agreement reached. Fuentes collected his folder, exchanged professional courtesies with Oscar, and left. As soon as the door closed, Oscar turned to me. Well handled. How far can they go with the shares line? If they try to prove fraud of creditors, they need to prove that the transfer was made with the specific intention of defrauding Consuelo of assets that would belong to her. The registration date of the transfer is prior to any formal procedural act, which makes that proof very difficult, but not impossible if they find some testimony or communication that links the decision to the conflict. No such communication exists. I know, but I need you to confirm that there is no message, no email, no conversation with anyone in which you mentioned the shares in relation to the conflict with Consuelo before the transfer was formalized. I mentally reviewed every relevant conversation of the last 2 years. The call to Oscar from the kitchen landline in March 2022. The meetings at the bar on Calle Ibiza. The signing of the power of representation. The notarial revocation. The Monday we signed a transfer to Nura. None. Then we're fine. I left Oscar's office with the draft response to the lawsuit signed and the agreement that the following Monday we would formally file the response with all the attached documentation. On the way to the metro, I passed by a cafe with tables on the sidewalk still occupied. Despite the November cold, with people sitting with their coats on and their cups steaming, I stopped for a moment for no particular reason. Then I kept walking. I spent the weekend finishing the valuation report. On Sunday afternoon, I reviewed it completely one last time, page by page, with the same rigor I would have applied to any professional expert opinion from my active years. It was a 22-page document with explicit methodology, verifiable sources, market comparisons, and conclusions signed under my technical responsibility as a certified property appraiser. When I closed it, I was satisfied with it, in the same way one is satisfied with a job well done, without euphoria, with the specific tranquility of someone who knows that what they have produced is solid and that they can back it up before anyone necessary. What I didn't know yet was that this report was going to have to undergo a test that even Oscar hadn't anticipated. The following Monday, a communication from the court arrived that would open a new line in the process. And in that communication, a name appeared that neither of us expected to find in any document related to this matter. Gonzalo's name. Gonzalo has submitted a declaration as a voluntary witness in favor of his mother. Oscar said it as soon as I entered the office on Monday, without waiting for me to sit down. He had the court communication on the table, open, with a line underlined in pencil in the second paragraph. I approached, read it, and sat down slowly. The communication was a brief from lawyer Fuentes informing the court that they were offering as testimonial evidence the declaration of Gonzalo Medina Ramos, son of the defendant, who claimed to have direct knowledge of conversations in which Aurelio Medina Fuentes had expressed his intention to modify the property division to the detriment of his spouse prior to the formal start of the process. The declaration was not attached, only announced. The brief requested that a date be set for its practice before the court. I read it twice, then left it on the table. What value does this have? It depends on what he says exactly when he testifies. If he claims to have heard from your mouth something specific about the transfer to Nura as a maneuver of asset stripping, the judge will have to value it as testimony, even if it's from an interested party. If a statement is vague or contradicts documentation already in the file, it weakens itself. I didn't say anything like that at any time. Not to Gonzalo, not to anyone. I know, but Gonzalo can testify to whatever he wants. What we have to do is make sure the documentation already in the file is so solid that any oral testimony contradicting it looks like what it is, an after-the-fact construction. I leaned back slightly in the chair, looking at the ceiling. A moment, Gonzalo had come to the building in trance the previous Wednesday. I had told him it wasn't the right time. 2 days later, his name appeared in a judicial communication as a witness for his mother. The order of these events was not coincidental. The visit to the entrance hadn't been to give me information about a change in Consuelo's strategy. It had been to get something from me, a reaction, a phrase, a detail that could be reinterpreted. And when he didn't get it, they had opted for formal testimony. It was the move of someone who has no evidence and needs to build it with words. When is the hearing? I asked. In 3 weeks. Enough time to prepare. What we did during those 3 weeks was precision work. Oscar reviewed with me every conversation I had had with Gonzalo since 2020 that could be subject to reinterpretation. We reconstructed them with the same methodology I used to build an expert report. Verifiable facts first, documented context second, absence of contrary evidence at the end. For every moment Gonzalo might mention, we had either documentation that placed it in a different framework than he could describe, or the simple absence of any record to support his version. The hearing was held on a Wednesday morning in December in a first-instance court in downtown Madrid. The room was small, with artificial light that flattened all colors and a ventilation system that emitted a continuous hum in the background. I sat next to Oscar at the table on the right. Fuentes and his colleague occupied the table on the left. Consuelo was not present. She had the right not to attend this phase and had chosen not to. Gonzalo entered through the side door, accompanied by an usher. He was wearing a dark suit I had never seen on him and an expression of someone who has rehearsed what they're going to say, but is not completely sure how it will sound when they say it out loud. He looked at me for a moment as he entered. I held his gaze without any additional gesture. He averted his eyes to the front. He testified for 40 minutes. His testimony was that in a conversation the previous summer, during the weeks before the anniversary, I had told him in general terms that we had to put things in order before Consuelo made a move. He claimed that he had interpreted that expression as a direct reference to the property reorganization. Oscar asked for the floor for cross-examination. Mr. Medina, can you state the exact date of that conversation? I don't remember the exact date. It was in the summer, the place at my parents' house. Were there other people present? No, we were alone. Did you take notes of that conversation at any time after it occurred? No. Did you mention it to anyone before your mother initiated the separation process? A pause to my mother. When? Another longer pause. I don't remember exactly. Oscar let 3 seconds pass before continuing. Mr. Medina, in the summer you were referring to, you were living in the apartment on Calle Bravo Murillo, for which your father paid the rent. Yes, that apartment was vacated by you in November of this year after receiving a formal communication from your father. Fuentes stood up to object. The judge heard him and allowed the question to continue. Yes, Gonzalo replied, and the company shares that your father transferred to you in 2015 were reverted in favor of your sister in the context of your father's legal actions against your mother's strategy. Yes. Thank you. I have no further questions. Gonzalo's testimony remained in the record, but the context Oscar had built around it, the sequence of verifiable facts showing that Gonzalo had a direct economic interest in the outcome of the process, was visible to any reading of the complete file without needing to be stated explicitly. What came close to getting complicated was at the end of the hearing when Fuentes requested the judge to include in the record a series of text messages that he claimed came from Aurelio Medina Fuentes' phone, sent to Gonzalo during the month of September, in which the family rearrangement was allegedly discussed in terms that Fuentes interpreted as confirmation of the testimony. Oscar immediately requested the floor. My client contests the authenticity of that communication and requests an expert verification of the device of origin before any inclusion in the record. The judge accepted the request. The inclusion was suspended pending expert verification. On the way to the parking lot after the hearing, I asked Oscar if those messages could be real. Did you send anything to Gonzalo in September that could be read that way? In September, I sent him a text message telling him to come to the office on Monday at 11. That's all. Then the expert verification is going to be very short. And so it was. The expert report arrived 17 days later. The messages presented by Fuentes came from a device different from Aurelio Medina Fuentes' number, and the metadata of the files presented showed a creation date after the date that appeared on the messages themselves. They were not authentic. The judge excluded them from the record and issued a formal warning to lawyer Fuentes about the presentation of documentation of questionable authenticity. Oscar called me with the news on a Tuesday morning with an economy of words that was characteristic of him when the result was as expected. The messages are out. The file is clean. We can close. The separation agreement was signed in January before a notary, with both parties represented by their respective lawyers. The division was based on the real market valuations that I had appraised. The 2 Madrid apartments were sold in the following months, and the proceeds of the sale were divided in agreed proportions. The Guadalajara house, accredited as separate property, was left out of the division. The unjust enrichment lawsuit was resolved with a compensation of 38,000 euros agreed out of court 2 weeks before the signing, far below the 180,000 euros they had initially claimed. The final result was exactly what Oscar had calculated the first time I presented the case to him at the bar on Calle Ibiza. Not a euro more, not a euro less than what was due. On the day of the signing, Consuelo and I did not look at each other directly at any point during the 40 minutes the notarial act lasted. She signed first, I signed second. The notary read each clause out loud with that specific cadence that notarial reading has between the rhythm of a legal text and that of something pronounced to be permanently recorded. When he finished, we stood up. Fuentes collected his folder. Oscar collected his. Consuelo left the room without stopping. I stayed a moment longer by the table with the pen still in my hand, looking at the last page of the document with my 2 signatures in the bottom margin, that of the power of representation and that of the final agreement. 2 signatures on the same paper that closed 40 years of something that no longer needed any additional name. I returned the pen to the notary, picked up my copy of the agreement, and left. Oscar was waiting for me in the hallway. We walked together to the street without saying anything until the January air of Madrid hit our faces with that dry coldness the city has in the quietest month of the year. "How are you?" he asked. "Fine." It wasn't an automatic answer. It was the truth with the precision it deserved. Neither euphoria nor weight, but the functional equanimity of someone who has reached the end of a long process with the structure intact. We said goodbye at the door with a handshake that lasted a second longer than usual. Then Oscar went to his car, and I went to mine. That afternoon, I went to Guadalajara. It took me an hour and 20 minutes to get there with the January traffic flowing, without the summer congestions. I parked in front of the house, took the key from the keyring, and went in. The smell of the house in winter, when it has been closed for several days, has a specific density. Wood, stale air, the faint trace of humidity controlled by the heating I left on minimum when I left in November. I opened the living room blinds. I turned on the heating, put water on for coffee. I stood by the window looking at the plot while the water took its time to boil. The plot in January has an austerity it doesn't have in any other season, without leaves, without flowers, without any element that occupies the eye with color. Just the earth, the tree trunks with their dark bark from the humidity, and the low, white sky of the Castilian plateau stretching as far as the eye could see. My parents had died in this house. My father first in 1998, sitting in the armchair that was still by the fireplace and that I hadn't moved in 25 years. My mother 4 years later in the upstairs bedroom, on an October morning with the window ajar, exactly as I'd left it the night before, because she told me she wanted to feel the air. They had built this with less than what I built later, and without any of the instruments I had, without computers, without mobile phones, without highways, without the tools that changed the world over the last 40 years. Just work and the certainty that what is made with one's own hands has a different solidity than what is obtained by any other means. I thought of Nura. She had called that morning before the signing to wish me well. I hadn't told her it was the final day. She knew anyway, which was something she did, anticipate things without anyone telling her and call it the moment she had to call without needing anyone to point out what that moment was. I thought of Gonzalo. I did so with a brevity that was not coldness, but the serenity of someone who has closed an account that has no outstanding balance for review. Gonzalo would have to build his own with his own hands, as I had done, as my parents had done before me, as anyone does who at some point in their life is left without the net that someone else had extended beneath their feet. It was not a wish of ill will for him. It was simply the natural and proportional consequence of the decisions he himself had made when he had the opportunity to make others. The water boiled. I made the coffee. I sat at the kitchen table with the cup between my hands, looking at the house's courtyard through the small window that faces north. The January cold filtered slightly through the wooden frame that I had needed to replace for 2 seasons and that I was now going to replace without any urgency at the time I chose, because the time of this house was now completely mine to decide how to use. At some point that afternoon, sitting in that kitchen with the coffee now cold and the outside light changing angle towards sunset, I understood something I hadn't been able to formulate with precision during all the previous months. It wasn't a philosophical conclusion or an ordered narrative closure. It was simply an observable fact of the kind one registers when looking at a structure and evaluating its real state. That of all that I had built over 63 years, what remained standing was not what was stated in any document or in any judicial file. It was what could not be appraised, what had no market price, nor expert valuation, nor any technical methodology that could quantify it. The way Nura had said that morning, "I hope everything goes well, Dad," without knowing it was the final day, the coffee my parents used to drink in this same kitchen before I was born. The way the January light entered horizontally through the north window and made the dust suspended in the air visible on the table. That dust that exists in all inhabited houses and is only seen when the light comes from the exact angle. I finished the cold coffee. I washed the cup, hung it on the usual hook next to the other 2 in the kitchen cabinet, and went out to the plot to check the gutter on the south side, which had become misaligned again the previous autumn and needed 20 minutes of work and the right hands to put it back in its place. I had the hands, I also had the time, and that, at 63 years old, on a January afternoon in Guadalajara, with the sky slowly clearing towards the west, was exactly enough.